Let's watch this instead. Let's watch obstacles to the China path in Latin America because I still want to react to a more theoretical economics type video here today. So.
Hi, this is Cockshott. Because of the timeline issues, I'm not in a good position to be able to give the talk. So I've decided to record it since it's supposed to be very short anyway. So I'm looking at the obstacles that there are to the Latin American countries having the success that China has had in terms of rapid economic development and social development. Now, in doing that, I'm going to be looking at the standpoint of classical political economy. If we go to Adam Smith, he says the key difference between feudalism and capitalism was the dominance of an unproductive landlord class which impeded capital accumulation. He says during the prevalence of
Adam Smith hated landlords.
People might not know that about Adam Smith. Oh, thank you for the subscription. Thank you. Adam Smith hated landlords because he saw them, like this implies, as a remnant of feudalism. Right? A class who just owns the land that people lives on and exploits them and takes money from them just because they own the land. It's entirely unproductive. And even according to Adam Smith, it was entirely unproductive. And capitalism should be based on productivity. So they actually, as Cockshott is saying, impede capital accumulation, which is one of the main functions of capitalism, which Marx analyzes heavily in Capital Volume 1 and 2, actually.
feudal government. A very small portion of the produce was sufficient to replace the capital employed in cultivation. It consisted commonly in a few wretched cattle, maintained altogether by the spontaneous produce of the uncultivated land, and which might therefore be considered as part of that spontaneous produce. It generally, too, belonged to the landlord, and was by him advanced to the occupiers of the land. All the rest of the produce belonged to him, too, either as rent for his land or as profit upon his paltry capital. The occupiers of the land were generally bondsmen, whose persons and effects were equally his property. So, he's describing the old order, which was had passed by the time he was writing. But he still saw the landlord class as an unproductive drain on society. The same position was taken by the next great classical economist, Ricardo, who held that there was a tendency...
And these guys we're talking about China right now, but these guys, Ricardo and Adam Smith, were analyzing Europe. As capitalism was coming about and as feudalism was becoming capitalism. So they're talking about the landlord class that was a remnant of feudalism left over in capitalist society.
...see for the income share of the landlord classes to rise, and that this led to a declining rate of profit and a declining rate of economic progress. In fact, this tendency of the share of rent to rise is very clearly seen in recent British and American economic statistics. You then go on to the next great classical political economist, Marx.
And
what he just said there is part of what is... We've been talking about how productivity has been shrinking in the U.S. and the U.K., part of it is because the wealthiest capitalists in our society are rentier capitalists who make their money off rent. So it's unproductive, right? It's people paying capitalists just to live in their house every month, and this is making massive profits. And these real estate capitalists, these rentier capitalists, are basically the oligarchy who run U.S. society. Right? There's less and less productive industrial or manufacturing capitalists who run our society, and there's more landlords. There's more people who own giant real estate empires. And largely because of this, our productivity is going down versus China recognizes that this is happening, creates economic plans to combat it, and their productivity and manufacturing are going up.
And if you look at the first demands in the Communist Manifesto, they're on the same theme, that of removing the unproductive drain of the landlord class. The very first demand was abolition of property in land and application of all rents to public purposes. The second, a heavy, progressive and graduated income tax. And the third, the abolition of all rights of inheritance.
And that would be still today one of the first things we should do in the U.S. is get rid of the landlord class, nationalize housing, because it's such a drain on workers and society as a whole.
Now, if we come to the 20th century, we see that the Chinese government, headed by Mao Zedong, followed these same principles. The landlord class was expropriated. The rent revenue became available either to the local communes to fund local accumulation, or by taxes to the central government to fund national accumulation. The removal of this drain has allowed China to sustain an absolutely huge rate of accumulation, reaching at times 45% of gross national product. It's this enormous rate of accumulation that allows for the rapid growth rate in China. And this
is why I compared China's manufacturing
to the U.S.'s financial rentier economy. And Michael Hudson has a really good piece, China Industrial Socialism versus U.S. Financial. It's like America's neoliberal financialization policy versus China's industrial socialism. So this talks about this. It talks about how the rentier class, the class of landlords, is a giant drain on American society. And bankers and landlords and financial unproductive capitalists control our society, whereas China has purposefully designed their society to increase manufacturing and hence increasing accumulation. And this is largely why China's society has grown so fast and is about to surpass the U.S. as the most powerful dominant economy on the planet. Not dominant, but the most powerful economy and fastest growing economy on the planet, is because they have avoided this unproductive rentier capitalist class, which basically runs American society, which has, a large control of the state and are some of the wealthiest people in the country. So it's the contradictions of capitalism which China is able to see and combat, which are holding the U.S. back. It's the unproductive nature of capitalist production that's holding us back versus China.
enormous rate of accumulation would have been impossible were it not for the expropriation of the old feudal or semi-feudal ruling class. Now, the effect of this rapid rate of capital accumulation allows improved productivity and also creates a big demand for labour, causing a rapid rise in real wages. In fact, the first graph here shows the index of labour costs in China rising rapidly. Federal Republic of Germany, USA, declining trend, i.e. labour becomes cheaper in those countries. In terms of real wages, we can see the Chinese trend here. Other Asian countries have very poor performance in comparison, apart from...
Look at that. Look at how their wages have risen compared to the U.S. I mean, I don't even know what there is to say about that. It's just incredible.
Thailand and Vietnam also has good performance, whereas in the metropolitan countries, wages have tended to fall. What other demands did Marx raise? Well, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly.
Also would be one of the first things we would have to do in the U.S., right?
Like I said, it's financial capitalists, so it's these real estate capitalists who run our society, but also banks. Giant banks like U.S. Bank and Chase Bank, who also have their hands in controlling industry and in, owning real estate. It's largely centralized. So the centralization of credit in the hands of the state and the creation of a national a national bank and state control of banking would be so vital to controlling our economy and building socialism. And taking power out of the hands of this oligarchy, this financial and real estate oligarchy, who controls our state and essentially controls every aspect of our lives in our society and our country.
Centralization of the means of transport and communication in the hands of the state. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands. Improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Now, the Chinese government has been guided by these principles, and these other measures were more or less followed. The state controls most of the banks, the railways, and owns a large share of the factories. Wastelands have been actively brought into cultivation or into forestry. For Latin America to follow the Chinese path means you have to start following it, not now, but start following the path China took from 19...
Very interesting. So Carlos and I have...
We've also critiqued the Latin American forms of socialism, and basically we have said that they need more control of the state, right? The working class needs a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Not just partial control of the state. They need to control the state and liquidate the landlord class. So nationalize the financial system, bring the means of communication and the means of transport under the control of the state. So like Venezuela, the only real industry that's heavily controlled by the state and creates a lot of revenue is their oil industry. And they use that oil industry to fund social programs which make people's lives better, right? But they still have this national bourgeoisie. There's still this powerful capitalist class in Venezuela. Capitalists, make the majority of the revenue, and those capitalists are always willing to collaborate with right-wingers in Colombia or with, of course, the imperialists in the U.S., and the Venezuelan opposition party is a great example of that. And I've always said, and people would say it's authoritarian and they would freak out, but Venezuela needs to get rid of that party, right? They need to nationalize this class. They need to liquidate the landlord class. They need more authoritarianism, as liberals would call it, basically meaning more central planning of their economy, right? The state needs to do more for workers, and it needs to be used as a tool of the workers to suppress the ruling capitalist class in order for these Latin American countries to develop themselves in a similar way to China. And Carlos and I, in our critique of, we did a co-written article about a comradely critique of the pink tide, a Marxist analysis of the new socialist tide in Latin America. And this is basically what we said. The proletariat in these Latin American countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, Honduras, Nicaragua, or Honduras just had a socialist win election, but these countries who have been trying to build socialism, they need the state to really crack down on the bourgeoisie and liquidate the landlord class the same way China has done, to allow for more accumulation and allow them to get around the U.S. enforced embargoes and sanction regimes.
49. The land in Latin America must be nationalized. The landlords must be liquidated as a class. The financial system nationalized. The main means of communication nationalized. And there must be a rapid extension of publicly owned factories. But that can only be done when the old state, the old machinery, which defends the rights of the landowners and landed property, is smashed, and new people's republics are established under the leadership of peasants and workers, as China did in 1949.
Yes. I wonder if Cockshott read our article. I wonder if Paul Cockshott read our article about how Latin American countries need more control of the state. Because at the end, he added in, they need to do what the People's Republic of China did and have a real revolution where the proletariat actually grabs state power and can use it as they see fit, right? And that's not the case in Venezuela and Bolivia and these other places where they've mostly taken power through elections. Venezuela is just revisionist. Yeah, I don't love that word, right? Because socialism and Marxism are constantly evolving. But there are certain principles of Marxism that there's a reason that Marx laid them out. And there's a reason that we should stick to them, like dictatorship of the proletariat being one of them, right? There's a reason workers, Marx said workers need full control of the state. They need to break up the state apparatus as it currently exists and use it for their own means. Basically, Venezuela needs to take full control of the state and use it to liquidate the landlord class, like Cockshott was explaining there. But they can't because they only have control of parts of the state, and they've taken control via election rather than revolution, which puts them at a disadvantage when it comes to combating imperialism, a disadvantage that China and Cuba and Marxist-Leninist nations don't have. So do you call that revisionism? Maybe. Maybe that's a place where the word revisionist actually works. But, as I said, there's still there's still a country who nationalized the U.S.-controlled oil company and who use it to fund social programs and who are constantly combating imperialism, right? And Maduro's biggest success as a president, even though his economic policies haven't been exactly what Marxists want to see, his biggest success is not allowing the U.S. to destabilize their country. He hasn't allowed the U.S. to topple their government yet. And they've had to make concessions to the bourgeoisie when I think they should be going the opposite direction and cracking down on the bourgeoisie. But the Bolivarian Revolution has been a huge thorn in the side of the United States, and Venezuela has been a huge thorn in the United States side. And as the socialist tide continues to go across Latin America, Venezuela will be very important, right? It'll be a hub of solidarity with other socialist movements. So we want them to move more socialist, though, right? We want Venezuela to achieve a dictatorship of the proletariat as Marxist-Leninists. I think that's a fair critique to make, and that's why Carlos and I made that critique in our video, and that's why Cockshott went in depth about the economics of China's system versus Venezuela and other Latin American countries, because there are some things that Venezuela could do to help build socialism, to help accumulate wealth in their country and get around the U.S. embargo and the U.S. enforced sanction regimes.